We are training the next generation to meet the strategic challenges of tomorrow. We are dedicated to understanding in order to act better.
Now we'll jump right into the second portion of this conference. This is about Afghanistan, NATO, and the big powers at stake. It gives me pleasure to introduce to you Ben Rowswell, our keynote honorary speaker, and I'll say a few words about Ben Rowswell.
Before we give him the stage, so he's the president and director at of research at Canadian International Council, the CIC. Now, for those of you who are outside of Canada, CIC, the Canadian International Council, is a not-for-profit organization that is present in more than 20 cities in Canada, and that has as a mandate to engage Canadian citizens in the development of our foreign policy. So before being at CSC, Mr. Rowswell was a Canadian diplomat for several years. He was an expert on security issues. In 2003, he was the first diplomat of Canada in Iraq after Saddam Hussein's loss of power. And then after he was the chief of diplomatic mission in Kabul. He was at the head of the NATO provincial reconstruction team in 2010. He concluded his diplomatic career as Canada's ambassador in Venezuela from 2014 to 2017. He is honoring us with his presence today, and his talk's title is Canada in Afghanistan, a power exercise. Hello, and thank you, and congratulations on this conference. Congratulations for your work at the Network for Strategic Analysis. I'm happy that you've built this network. We're very proud of this network. I think this network has already improved the level of analysis in the public debate on foreign policy and international security in Canada. So thank you, Jonathan, for organizing this conference today. And thank you to Brigadier General Giguère. We met in Afghanistan. We were together in Kandahar and during my mandate there. Mr. Rowswell, I forgot to mention that you're going to give us a 30 or 40-minute presentation to take the time that you want, and then we will have a questions period with the people who are with the auditors. We have 100 participants, so I won't interrupt you anymore. I'd also like to say that I will give my presentation in French.
I'm happy to take any questions in English afterwards, but given that Anglophones often take it for granted that Francophones are to just listen in the other language of Canada, I'll ask you to make that sacrifice this time. Je pense que c'est important d'expliquer la mission du Canada auprès de nos concitoyens francophones. Je vais aborder
I think it's important to do this presentation in French. I will address Canada in my presentation. I know that this conference is focusing on great powers. Canada obviously is not a great power, but the element that will draw a link between my presentation and this conference is the concept of power. It's a concept that's not as used in foreign policy, Canadian foreign policy, officially at least, and I think that's a mistake. It is a mistake because the world has changed a lot. We are in an international era where competition, geostrategic and geopolitical competition, is stronger. And I think Canadians are worried. They're worried about our capacity to continue defending our interests and to protect our security and to prosper. And I think they are right. They have good reasons to be concerned because the international law based on rules, the foundation of Canadian foreign policy for 3 generations, is in peril. It will require our action to protect our interests. We need to talk about it more explicitly. We need to grow our power and to exert our power in a much more explicit way. So the thesis I will propose during this presentation is that our mission in Afghanistan from 2001 to 2014 was exercising Canadian power, and we should think about the mission in that view, and that to some extent we could consider that mission as a success. Near the end of my presentation, I will explain which part of that mission should be considered a success. I do not deny the human misery that remains in Afghanistan today, in Kandahar, where we've invested so many resources and efforts and so many lives for a result that remains very far from what we hoped for the Afghan people. I will begin with a definition of power.
Joseph Nye.
I will use Joseph Nye's definition, the apostle of liberal internationalism. I think it still is appropriate because this theoretical framework in which the Canadian foreign policy tradition is instilled. The Canadian state thinks in your liberal internationalism. Joseph Nye says it is the capacity to influence the behavior of others to reach your objectives.
Power is the capacity to influence the behavior of others in order to obtain our objectives. Je vais aussi définir la mission du Canada.
I'll also define the mission of Canada as the contribution to the international effort of stabilizing and rebuilding Afghanistan between 2001 and 2014. And it was not the totality of Canada's engagement in Afghanistan, but I'll address our contribution to international security. So what is power? Power is the capacity to influence others to obtain your objective, to reach your objective. What was Canada's objective through Afghanistan's mission? I think it comes from our main objective in international relationships since the Second World War. It's to establish a world order based on rules. If we examine the 2001 context, at the beginning of Canada's mission in Afghanistan, there was one power, a superpower. That's the term we used at the time. It was the United States. And after September 11th, there was a threat to the international security, especially for the United States, but it was, the whole international order was disturbed by these attacks against New York and Washington 2001. The whole international community engaged to face this threat to international safety, including Canada. But the strategic question at the time, from the Canadian perspective, was if the response to that threat to international security was going to be offered through and in respect of international law and rules, and based on international law, or if it was going to be done not against these rules. So the Canadian objective was to make sure that the response would be would happen in a collective way through the United Nations according to international law and rules. And we want to reinforce this international regulation, these international rules and laws. So what happened in September 11th is that the Prime Minister Jean Chrétien called the American president at the time and promised to provide them with everything Canada could provide to offer a collective response to this threat. So I think that for us, the key question was if we could convince the United States to pursue in that path, according to the rules in the context of international institutions, to reinforce international law. So that was the behavior we wanted to influence with our resources. We have political, military, and economical and financial resources. These are the three resource categories we had. So let's begin with political resources. I will talk about diplomacy in a broad way, so that the will of the state and its capacity to declare its intentions and to deploy its resources to pursue its objectives. So the first step, which is very important in diplomacy, this step and this act is of Canadian origin. And it was 2 days after September 11th, so September 13th, 2001, there was an unprecedented declaration in the history of NATO. It was an alliance created to defend in a collective fashion all members based on Section 5, where member countries engage or commit to defending others. If there's an attack against one, the others offer a response. This had never been applied before September 13th, 2001. It was applied after the attack against the United States, and it's the Canadian ambassador, David Wright, our ambassador to NATO in Brussels at the time, that mentioned Section 5. And the meaning of that declaration is that the attack against the United States was considered as an attack against Canada, and that the war, starting September 13th, 2001, was our war as well, not only an American war. It was a very important political decision. And in this very long mission, there were several moments, decision moments, where Canada maintained its position on the primacy of its position in this situation. So in 2002, after the Taliban were kicked out, and after the new government came into place with Amir Karzai, chief of government, at the time, we sent a battle group, troops in Afghanistan. In 2004, we accepted command of the NATO ISAF mission, the International Stability Assistance mission, with Lieutenant General, the Canadian Lieutenant General at the time, who took leadership of that mission. In 2006, during when the Taliban came back and there was a violence outbreak in the south of Afghanistan, we led the NATO mission in that province. The headquarters of the Taliban, and we contributed with troops. And at its height in 2008, we provided a $300 million support and development assistance. And we decided to continue in Afghanistan even after the end of our combat mission, which we converted into a training mission of the Afghanistan National Army. So for more than 10 years, all decisions that were taken were in view to maintain presence in Afghanistan, which is rare. It was a priority. It was an unprecedented decision in a country, Afghanistan, that was very far from Canada and very different from Canada socially and economically. We still maintained our presence and our support in Afghanistan. So other political tools that we set forth for the Afghanistan mission was the reorganization of the Canadian mission to deliver on this priority in each of the international ministries or departments of the foreign affairs, defense departments. And at the Privy Council, we established task forces, huge task forces with dozens of employees. So for Afghanistan, we established a deputy minister, not as an assistant deputy minister, but a deputy minister that was dedicated to Afghanistan. That is unprecedented in Canada's history. Now let's move on to the military tools, the ones that had the highest profile. Throughout the 13 years where Canada contributed to the NATO mission in Afghanistan, 40,000 soldiers were deployed in Afghanistan. That is about half of Canada's Army's troops. From the onset, during the American invasion in 2001, a few weeks after the September 11th events, there were Canadian Special Forces with the American troops. During Operation Freedom, there were Canadian troops, and Canadian troops were in the ISAF NATO mission as well. The combat troops sent in 2004-2006 were amounted to a whole division of the Canadian Army. Eventually, the government imposed a limit of 3,000 troops, but in a few occasions we exceeded this limit. It was the first combat mission since Korea, and it had a transforming effect on Canadian forces. Eventually, with the Afghani National Army training mission based in Kabul, we sometimes had up to 100 soldiers in Afghanistan, and we paid the price. We paid the price, the ultimate price, with 158 Canadian soldiers deceased in Afghanistan. On top of those soldiers, around 2,000 were injured. And one of the main changes in modern war is that soldiers can be badly wounded but still survive thanks to medicine deployed in combat zones. So some of these injuries were very bad and some were permanent. So one of the other aspects of modern war is the amount of victims after the end of the deployment through suicide. So that's a huge problem in armed forces across the world, the suicide rate of their troops. In these 20 years since the beginning of our mission in Afghanistan, the Canadian Armed Forces lost 175 troops to suicide, and a lot of them had been deployed in Afghanistan. And also a diplomat lost his life, as well as 4 journalists lost their lives in Afghanistan. So the cost of this mission was very high. Now, about the financial resources that we invested to exercise Canada's power, we're talking about $18 billion. I think this refers to the 20 years, not only the 13 that I'm focusing on today. Now, our support to development funds amounted to $1 billion over 20 years. If we are focusing on the whole mission since 2001, we invested mainly in men and women equality rights, social programs, programs against violence against women. In the period where I was there, about $154 million was spent in Kandahar. It's a huge amount of money. We had 3 main projects at the time: rebuilding the Dala Dam, which was the water source for a huge agriculture sector that depended on this water source. We built a few dozen schools for the alphabetization of women. When we arrived, only 9% of women in Kandahar could read and write, and that raised to 60% during the period of our action. So these are the 3 categories of resources we invested to obtain our objective, that is to ensure a collective response to this threat to international security. Now, I will use my personal experience to provide my analysis, my personal experience in Afghanistan between 2008 and 2010. So throughout this long mission, I wasn't there the whole mission, but I was there at the middle of the mission, and between 2008 2010, this was the This is the period where we had the highest number of troops, diplomats, and development programs. So I fulfilled 3 roles. The first one was at the Privy Office, where I was a counselor or consultant on international matters for the committee, the Priority and Planning Committee, the Plans and Priorities Committee. That is the decision-making committee of the Prime Minister. My role was to prepare the Prime Minister for when he was presiding this committee for taking decisions on behalf of the government of Canada, especially with regards to international matters. And in 2008, it was Afghanistan, Afghanistan, Afghanistan. It retained more than 50% of the attention of the cabinet in international matters. Then I was deputy mission chief. That was number 2 of the mission in the embassy. At the time, we had 90 employees. So in terms of Canadian employees, it was the 7th biggest Canadian embassy in the world, which is surprising. And the 3rd position I held after my year in Kabul, I was promoted to a position of representative of Canada in Kandahar, following the response of the government to the John Manley report in 2017. We had an important civilian mission to support the military mission with 80 diplomats, experts in development support, police to train the Afghani police and other civilian experts under the guidance of this senior position called the representative of Canada in Kandahar. And it is true, especially during that year that I spent in Kandahar between the summer of 2009 and 2010, where there were 3 moments where I think we demonstrated, or we were tested. Our capacity to exercise power was tested. As a state, was tested. The first one was more symbolic. It's symbolic. Several incidents. That's when we lost lives. But in Kandahar, during the most dangerous times was December. The most dangerous day was December 30th, 2009. It was a mission military with 2 civilians that were on a mission to engage the population in the region of Dan in the south of Kandahar. It's a village. It's a small community south of Kandahar, where we were exercising a governance and rebuilding program for the government of that district. It was a very important experience in the Canadian mission. And traditionally, it's the military called CIMEX, that is experts in civilian military relationships, that usually held these programs. But through the increase of civilians in our mission, we brought a lot of professional diplomats and experts in political systems of the countries. And one of my decisions as a chief of mission was to ensure that these political experts would leave our base on a daily basis to engage with the Afghani population, to have a better idea of what the Kandahar people believe and think, what their preferences are, what their concerns and worries are. Do they support the government? Do they support the Taliban? So we truly wanted to understand the country in which we were trying to have an impact. That was the mission of December 30th, 2009. In this convoy, we had CIMIC agents, Canadian Forces agents. We had 1 Canadian diplomat, someone who he was from Pakistan, but he spoke the language and he knew the culture. And we had a journalist from the Herald, Calgary Herald. When the provincial rebuilding team went to the base in Kandahar, in south of Kandahar, in Dant, the convoy was going through a rural area, rural road, and it went under a training bridge that was filled with 100 kilograms of explosives. And when the detonation happened, it was probably detonated by a cell phone. The armored vehicle that was directly up on the bridge went up around 30 meters in the air and fell upside down. There were 10 people in that vehicle, that armored vehicle, and 5 of them died instantly. The other 5 were badly injured. George Mioch, 28-year-old surgeon from Edmonton, died. Zachary McCormick, 21 years old, from Edmonton. Sergeant Kirk Taylor, 28 years old, from Dartmouth. And Soldier Garrett Shirley from Oakville in Ontario, as well as the Herald journalist, the Calgary Herald journalist called Michelle Lang. She was 34 years old at the time. She was the first Canadian journalist to die in a combat zone. Among the wounded, there were 4 soldiers and one of my employees, a 26-year-old diplomat that lost his leg. And to give you an idea of the gravity of the injuries of Canadians that served in Afghanistan, it took him 20 surgeries to recover over the 2 or 3 years. That follows. She's back in service now. She's a wonderful employee that does a great job. This was a very difficult moment for everyone in the mission. I still had the opportunity to manage several teams of Canadian diplomats in very dangerous zones in Baghdad between 2003 2005, in Kabul, Kandahar, at the beginning of my career in Mogadishu, and near the end in Caracas, which is not a war zone, but still a dangerous area with a very big Canadian mission at the time. As mission chief, I exercised what we call an exterior service, the duty of care. That's what I exercised, which is a legal responsibility to observe, measure, and manage risks for the personnel, and to judge of the importance of the mission, to then balance the objectives of the government of Canada to pursue our interests, but also to protect our personnel. What I observed throughout all my missions is that when there is a high risk, we need to measure the importance of the mission. And more, I find that the risks are too high in the calculations of the government of Canada. The risks are too high, and the objective of the mission is not high enough. That's why we closed the embassy in Caracas. That's why we closed the embassy in Tehran. We closed the embassy in Damas. We closed the embassy in Kabul in 2021, because these calculations, internal calculations, the other instances of the government of Canada do not consider these missions to be important enough to put our personnel at risk. But it was not the case on December 30th, 2009. We took all possible measures to protect our personnel, except to keep them in the military base and not allow them to leave, to go out. The decision I took as a chief of the team, in consultation with the military and with all of our consultants at the Canadian Forces, was to get our personnel to go out of the military base. A few days later, I personally went with the General Director, Elissa Wilberg, that was visiting with her. We were escorted by the Canadian Forces. We went on foot to a bazaar in Kandahar, and we continued the mission. It was a decision that benefited from the full support of upper management in Ottawa. So even when we could see the very high risks in which we put our personnel against, we did not hesitate to pursue the mission. And I think that is a demonstration of the seriousness of the government of Canada at the time, that we continue to operate not only with putting our soldiers in very dangerous missions, but also maintaining the objectives of the mission, because it was so important. The second time where we had a test of the power of Canada was the mass arrival of American troops. In 2009, we had a new president in the United States, Barack Obama, that came to power, presenting himself against the war in Iraq, but he wanted to succeed in Afghanistan. After a few months of reflection, strategic reflection, he decided to send 35,000 troops, additional troops, to Afghanistan. That was the Barack Obama's surge. Out of these 35,000 soldiers, most went to the south of Afghanistan, where the war was raging, and of those, most went to Kandahar. So where we were with our 3,000 soldiers, Americans sent 10,000 soldiers in the same year. I was there. And with all these soldiers, they also had all their civilians and diplomats, state personnel, employees of the USAID, and all of their financial resources. That was a challenge for us because it was our territory, Kandahar. We were responsible in the mission among all the NATO countries of security, governance, support of that state. So with the arrival of 3 times the amount of American soldier compared to our armed forces, with so many diplomats and employees of the government of the United States,
usually Americans take care of their own things. They take care of their own mission. They manage things in and of themselves. This would have been a disaster, likely so, for Afghanistan to have 2 different missions from 2 different NATO countries on site. After months and months of negotiation, we were able to include our mission in a way as to create a very tight integration. To just mention the civilian side of things, I was in charge of that. Personally, we were able to convince Americans to send their own staff for the state or provincial, local reconstruction team. I was the lead on that, and we included them in our team. We had a joint team comprised of more than hundreds of civilians from the US and Canada under one single control command central, anyway. And so we had different people from the US and Canada, same thing for our experts in the field of communication, for our police officers and so on, and our political officers. We had the same central command and so on. So we jointly worked in full integration between 2 allied governments. This was the tighter collaboration since WW2. This was a joint success at a micro level regarding everything that we want to do at a macro level, i.e. trying to ensure a collective answer to a threat to peace and security at the international level. Via institutions, we had this joint effort shared by the US and Canada. Thirdly, third decisive moment for Canadian powers, this was facing or challenging bribery, corruption. We had a lot of diplomats on site. We talked to Afghans, and we wanted to know what their perspective was, how they saw things. And the perspective on what was occurring was quite clear. What arose from that consultation was obvious. There was a total loss of confidence in Karzai's government. They thought that the government was totally corrupt. There was no rightful government there in terms of Karzai, in terms of allied communities. There might have been a link there, but not with the population. There was abuse from the police in penitentiaries and everywhere, and so there was no accountability for Karzai's government. This was a state or a province where Karzai was not popular right from the onset. it was not quite popular, but it became the central command point for the Taliban. So this was a corruption issue, which was obvious. We were fully dedicated on site, trying to convince the remainder of the international community to take this corruption issue seriously and to challenge President Karzai because he was the president of the country, but also Ahmed Wali Karzai, his older brother, had a position there as provincial council or state council president, but he was the leader and Kandahar. He was in charge of all legal and illegal activity. He had his own armed forces, jails, and so on. This was an abuse because Karzai was involved in that situation, which means that the population lost confidence in the Afghan state. You know, the brother was in charge, and so we were able to convince the leader of NATO's mission, UN mission, ambassadors from the British ambassador, US and Canadian also. We convinced them. We told him, get rid of your brother, Wahil Karzai, and he said no. He decided not to discard his brother. He believed that Western countries needed him more than the contrary. This was a huge assumption from Karzai. The international mission leaders almost accepted that position. And that was the end of the whole case. We continued working with Ahmad Wali Karzai at the time. And so out of these three events, we had resolved in order to end the number of deaths. We wanted to have a Canadian decision-making power with the US. This was successful as an initiative, but we totally failed in our challenge of corruption. In my own opinion, this is the very reason why the government eventually fell. When NATO's mission ended, the US troops were withdrawn. There was low support for the democratically elected government afterwards at the international level. And so I believe that this accounts for a failure vis-a-vis our own responsibilities that we had in turn vis-a-vis the Afghans. So to end my appreciation of this, my first conclusions, firstly, we realized that Canada can exercise power. We have an objective. Our goal, our main goal was not to address human rights in Afghanistan. It was about strengthening the international order based on the rule of law to ensure collective answer that's adequate to threats against peace and international security. The very decision to provide significant contribution to this Afghan mission or in Afghanistan, along with many other levels, this made sure that the international answer in Afghanistan would be under the leadership of the UN Security Council, that it would approve it so that it would be a legal framework approved by the international authorities leading towards democracy. You have to admit that the US invasion of Iraq 2 years afterwards is going against this. This has undermined international order based on the rule of law because the US government has ignored the rules. This is not legal. It's not justifiable. You cannot invade a country with your own military forces without the UN approval. There was really a case for an infringement on Iraq's territory. And so this was an abuse on international rules in the international setting and international community. So this lasted for 13 years. Yes, 13 years of involvement. For a few years, the American action in Iraq has gone against our own objectives, but we decided not only to remain involved in Afghanistan, but to double down on our efforts towards the right legitimate warfare, thus offering a contrast against illegal warfare and massive strategic errors, what the US troops did in Iraq. That's why we focused on Kandahar, the most dangerous, perilous region in Afghanistan. In 2008, after 2007, when they elected a president that was denouncing the Iraq war, the US government changed and they started respecting the international rule of law in terms of involved forces. There was Barack Obama, and this is after our Canadian mission in Afghanistan. That's only then that we were able to strengthen the credibility of the alliance in full integral compliance with international forces. That's how I see that Canada was able to foster the implementation of our powers. We exercised our powers in a way, in a manner that fulfilled our achievements, even though we didn't meet with our other goals. The second conclusion, the mission in Afghanistan has shown that we were limited in our powers. Obviously, once we go beyond 100 deaths, in 2007 we had more than 100 deaths, that's when the cost of the mission started to be hard to accept. 2007 marks the year also when we saw some great mistakes being done within the mission, how prisoners were treated. They were sent to Afghan prisons after being captured, seized on the warfields and so on, the torture practices in those jails. This has shown that we didn't have enough experience in such operations when we have combat missions. It was hard for us to sustain the enforcement of international rules, and there was a loss of national support within the Canadian population. Afterwards, there was tension between the different leaders comprising the government, the political levels, Canadian forces, between them and the civilian forces. In 2007, we started seeing the cost of the mission in Afghanistan. In 2007, however, I think that we started seeing that benefits had been reached. The returns were obtained already because of the collective answer to the Al-Qaeda's threat and how Afghanistan was managed. After the failure of the US troops in Iraq, after the US awareness, their shift when they realized in the US as a government that their approach was a mistake, and after reaching our main objective about ensuring that the international rule of law would be enforced, after 2007, the cost of the mission was far exceeding and outweighing the benefits. And I don't believe that there's a coincidence here. Prime Minister Harper asked in 2007, asked John Manning to review the mission and to take the lead after the Manley report, where a deadline was set for the mission. The end of the mission was envisaged, and we were supposed to leave in 2011 the combat zone and end our mission. Our combat mission in 2011 was supposed to end there. We still remained there in our mission for a few years, but in 2007, Canada decided to exit Afghanistan, to withdraw from it. So in conclusion, well, that's it. If you have any questions, go ahead. But Canada can exercise power. That's one of the lessons that we learned, but our capacity is limited. Second of all, we have to develop in order to go beyond those limits. We were able to identify a priority. We've worked on that, and we were able to further allocate our resources as a country in order to reach our goals. We were able to show that our politicians can maintain that priority for more than a decade. There wasn't a lot of involvement of the Canadian Parliament at the time, but that we were able to show that cohesion was possible, and we were able to obtain strong political support for that mission, which is quite dangerous, which is very, very away from our borders in a remote area, in a location where we don't have a lot of experience. We didn't have a lot of experience. Yes, we can commit towards protecting our own interests and to enforce further the rule of law in a very remote location. That's the first lesson. We can do it. And second of all, when we want to withdraw, we won't be able to bring stability to our country. We further strengthened the alliance, but we weren't able to secure Afghanistan, partly because we didn't want to face the context in Afghanistan, the corruption of government Karzai, and because of the conflicts he had with his own population. We have not taken stock of the situation and determined how we could play a political role in Afghanistan with all of our troops and resources that were supporting one side of the political opponents in the political debate. We didn't take our responsibilities in order to ensure that corruption would end, so that we would foster the implementation of the rule of law. We were able for Canada, but we failed the Afghans. That's my conclusion after the mission in Afghanistan. A success for Canada, failure for Afghanistan. I hope that there will be a next time maybe, and next time I hope we'll be able to generate political willingness so that we can so significantly contribute. As was the case in Afghanistan, there are threats pretty much around, and but whenever there are threats, I hope we'll be as serious as when we went to Afghanistan. But I hope that then we'll be able to do this sustainably and remain with our partners on site, taking whatever time is necessary to bring about safety and stability to the region. I will now conclude here and stop and consider your questions. Thank you very much for your presentation. This was so interesting to hear someone speak, someone that participated in this mission. Obviously, as a university professor, I have an external academic point of view, but it's interesting to have an insider's position. For me, at least, it's very interesting. I would like to invite the Brigadier General Richard Giguère, if you want to intervene a bit later, because he did 2 rounds of work in Afghanistan. He played a significant role there. But quickly, Ben, I have 3 quick questions for you, if that's possible, regarding what you said. First of all, do you consider that Canadian governments, I'm alluding to Jean Chrétien and Stephen Harper, from Chrétien to Harper, all Canadian governments have failed in explaining the Canadian mission in Afghanistan. They have failed to explain the value of that mission to the Canadians, Pedagogically, there's a failure there. Since the very first years, and then until 2005, when they decided to intervene in Kandahar, a lot of Canadians thought that we were doing some peacekeeping work, what we did in Cyprus and things like that. But the day when Canadian soldiers started coming back to the country in coffins, this was in 2005, 2006, and 2007, when the struggles intensified. And then all of a sudden, Canadians realized that that was not such the case. So the ins and outs of that very warfare, has this been pedagogically explained to Canadians? Number one. Number two, when you talk about the Canadian objectives, you concluded that this was a success for Canada. It may not have been a success for the Afghan populations, and I would understand that, but there's cynicism. Maybe some observers would have said, or have said, that our main objective was to be the right ally for Washington and NATO, and therefore that the means we've deployed for that war in Afghanistan, that all of this enabled us to succeed for that very goal, and that victory in Afghanistan was a secondary objective only, ultimately. This might be bring us some degree of controversy, but the objective of Canada, as you said, was to ensure the stability of the rule of law in a very precise context. But in the end, was this not the main primary objective vis-a-vis our main partners? I was struck by how this war was waged eventually. In 2009, in January, Barack Obama came up with a surging strategy, with a surprising strategy in Afghanistan. And Stephen Harper, the Canadian Prime Minister, went to the United States in the same time, and he had his interview with CNN, Fareed Zakaria's interview, and so he explained that we no longer have the intent to fight as we did in the past. So said he in Afghanistan, because anyway, it's impossible to bring peace to this country, which I was always at war. So he announced the Canadian will to the U.S. that we want to withdraw from Afghanistan slowly but steadily, while Obama is implementing the surge. How was this interpreted in Canada? You talked about the exercise of power, this very idea whereby he told Americans, okay, do whatever you want, but we are withdrawing. This was an exercise of political sovereignty from the part of the Canadian government, from the part of Stephen Harper, while the situation was so dramatic for the U.S. So how did you understand this for Canadians present in Afghanistan and so on? How did you perceive the whole situation vis-a-vis those two things? Go ahead. Very good questions. There was a communication error or mistake, and I agree fully. The government was not able to convey the right objective. It's not that this was an objective in secrecy, but I don't believe that we are used to thinking in terms of geopolitical strategy concerns for the power of the exercise of power. That's why I want to explain the mission from the strategic context. In that sense, the mission makes sense, but the terms that were used to convey justification about the mission are the more known terms from foreign policy to further the advancement of human rights, gender equality between men and women, peace. These objectives are important for us, of course, but if the contrary is not true, but if our mission is to make sure that peace prevails, well, there are other conflicts that are closer to our own Canada borders. So human rights abuse exists pretty much everywhere around the planet. So why justifying war from that point of view based on gender equality to go to Afghanistan? This is not justifiable vis-a-vis the Canadians, for Canadians. And so 1 year after coming back to Canada, I had an opportunity because I talked to one former ambassador from Canada in Afghanistan, Canadian ambassador in Afghanistan, and the question was, why are we involved there? Why are we there as Canadians? He thought that this was about stabilizing Afghanistan, which was the ultimate goal. And I had further the same argument that I've just shared with you. The idea was to strengthen consistency and credibility for the alliance. We had a huge debate about that, about which was the foremost objective. Even for the Canadian government, it was hard to address this clarity. So why the conclusions that we derive from this experience are not just about the relationship or the decisions made from one government to another during the crossover of power, whatever we do at the public level as Canadians, in terms of being able to think about this very notion of power, because decision-making will be improved and will be able to better convey this decision-making process to Canadians if we deal with that. Now, second of all, is it possible to be the right ally of the U.S. if the alliance per se fails in the mission? I'm trying to express your question in different terms. My conclusion is that we succeeded. I asserted that. Well, I wouldn't say that we were able to show that we were a great ally, not just vis-a-vis Washington, but we showed the world and other democracies that we can be good allies, mainly. So we've told the world that a collective answer, a democratic answer, can have a big influence. It's not because we're Washington's little brother and we're trying to please them. No, we ensure our security complying with international rules because we have an international community. the integrity of alliance, we significantly contributed to that alliance. Was necessary between 2001 and 2014. But this alliance doesn't hold a lot of integrity in 2022. It's not as serious as an instrument or tool for our collective security after the Afghanistan defeat. I don't believe that Americans have criticized us publicly. They have not complained and said that we abandoned them in Afghanistan because we had done so many sacrifices anyway. So it was very hard to justify such assertion. But at the very end, the US troops were left alone in Afghanistan with some British troops, maybe and Australian troops anyway. This was NATO's mistake, I think, because I don't believe that NATO was the appropriate tool in order to start doing a military operation so far from Europe. NATO did not have legitimacy to do those operations in Central Asia. We've used this international collaboration mechanics, but we were vulnerable in the sense that we would impose values and opinion from the Western world onto the Afghan context. We thought, even for ourselves, we had a tendency to think this may not be appropriate to talk about human rights, gender equality in Afghanistan and so on, because we perceived the mission as Western mission. We should never have structured this as a Western mission with European forces and US forces. No, this is a Western mission. It's an international mission, not Western, because we have to further international values, and we should have done a NATO-based approach. Second of all, the leadership of the on-site Canadian mission in view of some deadlines. We thought we would exit the situation earlier. This has undermined our capacity. We had a lot of capacity with a lot of troops, a lot of soldiers and money and resources, so we could manage things. But when we said that we were exiting the context, everybody started preparing for the time when Canadians would no longer be there, the post-Canadian times. This was a strategy mistake. We should not have announced that maybe that way. We should have had some objective assertion without mentioning a deadline, a timeline. It's always a military mistake when you come up with a timeline. For stabilization purposes, it's always a mistake to talk about a timeline with a deadline, because then your opponent can have an edge over you time-wise. Richard Giguère, do you want to speak? Thank you so much. We have only 2 minutes left before lunch. This is quite tight. Well, thank you, Ben. I'm very pleased to see you again here. Quickly, we'll have a panel on that this afternoon, but your point of view on the following question: is this a role to be played by NATO? Was this the case? Very good question. And by the way, the impact we've seen on the field concretely is that we saw a deployment of NATO with different speeds of deployment. You will remember that we had 4 sectors. I mean, Afghanistan is divided in 4 segments. And it was interesting to see where NATO countries positioned themselves. The southern states were the most dangerous ones, and some segments were different. I mean, I don't want to minimize the participation of allies, but some zones were more safe or secured in the northern region of the country. Certain countries were more at ease involving themselves in the north rather than in the south for security purposes. And the national caveats and engagement rules also, they differed from one nation to another. So from a certain point of view, this has undermined slightly the consistency as pertains to NATO. Not everybody saw the Afghan conflict in the same way. And last thing, I totally agree with you. In French, we have an expression that alludes to a time-based mission when you state publicly, we are leaving, exiting the country on such and such date. It's totally not useful. It really creates issues for the people that remain on the field. So it's not a good idea. That's it. Thank you. Thank you, Richard. Thank you so much to everyone. This is the end of a keynote address. Thank you, Ben, and so on. On behalf of the Strategic Alliance Network, thank you so much, Ben.
This important mission that Canada conducted for, 15 years. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Have a good afternoon. And for all of us, this is now lunchtime. Please come back at 1:30 for our second panel. It's going to be on the impact of the end of the war in Afghanistan on NATO. So we will continue the discussion on NATO. We will have 4 great panelists. Chiara Rufa from the University of Uppsala in Sweden, Alexander Lanovska from the University of Waterloo, Annie Nasser from the Department of National Defense of Canada, and Heidi Hart from the University of California, Irvine. The second panel will be moderated by Brigadier General Richard Giguère. So thanks to all of you. Please come back at 1:30. We'll continue this great discussion on Afghanistan. Thank you. See you later.